What's up, my Yu-Gi Bros? I'm your host, the one, the only, the RJB0. Welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! And Business Casual. It is appearing that Monday is my day to become the unpopular opinion puffin of YouTube. Wait, does that mean I get to? What's up, guys? This is the unpopular opinion puffin of YouTube. Eat your heart out, Storm Lathrop. Anyway, it is a fairly popular opinion among players of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! To not like archetypes as a whole and what they do for the game. Many say that they cut out diversity, and others say that their cookie-cutter style destroys creativity. The unpopular, but possibly truer opinion, however, is that archetypes are actually better for those two aspects of the game than non-archetypal decks. This is not to say that I am pro-archetype and anti-non-archetypal deck. That is not at all the case. I'm a huge fan of decks like Plant Synchro, and I even enjoy the most egregious violators of the discussions I'll be talking about today, things like Teledad and Dino Rabbit. But I have to say, objectively speaking, that archetypes may have been the saviors of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! One of the major criticisms of archetypes is this idea that since Konami is putting all the good cards into a small set of decks, it cuts out diversity because that small set of decks have all the powerful support in the game. But in actuality, the opposite of this process happens. Have you ever thought about the fact that before archetypes gained power, every format was a tier 0 format? Even after that, when there wasn't a strong set of archetypes, it was almost always a format dominated by one deck. Take, for instance, Teledad, which used a really loose hero engine, but mainly surrounded some non-archetypal cards. This happens because when all of the good cards in the game are generic, they can all go into the same deck. This meant that in order to be competitive, players had to run the deck that had the consolidation of all of the best cards. Otherwise, they were simply using suboptimal cards to make their deck. Not very conducive to diversity. What you need in order to create diversity in the game is a separation of powers, and that's what archetypes do inherently. Making archetypes necessarily splits the best cards of the format into fairly mutually exclusive decks, which gives a format built-in diversity. Now, this system isn't perfect because occasionally an archetype does get all of the best cards in a format. That's fairly rare now, as Konami does have profit incentive to make sure that they continue to sell new things, and it's really tough to just keep selling support for one archetype. So it is arguable that archetypes are the source of diversity in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, since instead of being almost guaranteed a one-deck format, we have 3 or 4 decks at a time that are very powerful and that keep the meta to themselves. Now, even laying aside those tier 0 formats in which non-archetypal decks just wiped the floor with everybody, it is still, to this day, generally true that non-archetypal decks are limiting factors in a format. But what about creativity? That seems to be the biggest criticism of archetypes, that they take a cookie-cutter formula and do not allow you to branch out the possibilities of your deck. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this is certainly true of some archetypes. For instance, wind-ups during the later part of the 2012 format. But it's not always true, and it's certainly less true than in the formats where a non-archetypal deck dominates. When the dominating deck in a format is basically a conglomerate of the best cards in the format with maybe a small archetypal engine tossed in, such as with Teledad, that is not very much room for creativity. Mostly because after we find the best combination of those best cards, which happens real quickly because we Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are really good at finding the best combinations of a bunch of really broken-ass cards, after that, there isn't really much room for improvement. Small tweaks happen throughout the format, but for the most part, the deck essentially stays the same. Optimizing an archetype, however, has historically, not necessarily in theory, taken a lot more work. It took a format and a half to develop the quote-unquote best build for Shadows, and Shadows are still getting variants to this day. That's because when the power of your deck is limited by the fact that all of the best cards of the format are split up between a bunch of decks, you have to do a lot of tweaking and a lot of working and a lot of testing and a lot of trial and error to optimize that deck to make it better than other decks in the format. As a result, for the majority of archetypal decks, the build never really stops changing, even on a larger level. Once again, this is not always true. There are some archetypes that pretty much make a cookie cutter deck with forts. And it's not necessarily the case that non-archetypal decks are always uncreative. But it's certainly not fair to go out there and say that the reason why Yu-Gi-Oh! Has become an uncreative and undiverse game is because of the existence of archetypes. Heck, I would even argue that Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't an uncreative and undiverse game, but players will often overlook that just because the decks they like aren't topping. So that is my thought on archetypes in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I hope you liked this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why in the comment section below, and of course, argue with me if you want and discuss whether or not you think archetypes are good for the game. Thank you guys for watching. I am your host, the one, the only, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.